I know you like to do those like quirky cold opens where somebody says something crazy, so I think you're gonna like to hear about the unmade Godzilla movie where Godzilla dies of diabetes, so people turn her corpse into a spaceship and send it back to fight in a revolution on the Godzilla home planet.
Oh, that old thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, welcome to Japan Station. My name is Tony Vega. When you think of the word kaiju, you probably think of two things. One is Pacific Rim, because let's face it, Pacific Rim really did make that term mainstream outside of Japan. But the other is, well, Godzilla, right? Godzilla is the king of the monsters, and you cannot escape that. But the reality is that there is so much more to the world of kaiju than just those two movies. There's an almost endless amount of kaiju movies, and my guest today is an absolute expert on the topic. Kevin Derendorf is the author of Kaiju for Hipsters, 101 Alternative Giant Monster Movies. Like the title implies, he goes way beyond just Godzilla and Mothra and Gamera and all the kind of mainstream monsters that you've probably heard of. He goes really, really deep, and he examines the whole history of the genre and goes behind the scenes and connects people and says, you know, this person worked on this movie, which ended up influencing this person. And it's just like a butterfly effect of kaiju movies. It's really, really great stuff. And there's a whole lot of weird and wacky stuff in there, which I'm quite fond of. So, and there's a lot of interesting cameos by some people you might have heard of. So if you're at all into anime, you're probably familiar with Hideaki Anno, for example. And he is, of course, the guy behind Neon Genesis Evangelion and Gunbuster and involved with the whole Gainax Studios. And yeah, he's done countless stuff. Animator, director. Yeah, a peculiar guy. And he has some very interesting connections to the whole kaiju genre. So we talk about Hideaki Anno and a whole bunch of other stuff, some really, really weird stuff like you probably heard in the cold open. Anyway, so let's get to the kaiju and let's get to Kevin. Here you go. Here's Kevin Derendorf.
The next stop is Japan Station. The doors on the right side will open.
So yeah, like I was saying, I think maybe it would be good to start with perhaps the most basic, fundamental question. So what is kaiju aside from that word that they use in Pacific Rim?
Yes, well, a lot of people are under the misassumption that kaiju is a term that was invented for Pacific Rim, and that grinds my gears as one of those weeaboos that's been using the term since the 1990s.
Right.
And, you know, there's a little bit of debate around the usage of the term. You know, I can go into how it's used in Japan versus how it's used over here. You know, it's just like with any loan word. You know, you have if you say sombrero, you get a specific image. But in Spanish, that just means hat. And then they'll be the people that are like, oh, it's not a real sombrero unless it comes from Mexico or something. And then you have to get into a debate about it. So just like that with kaiju, there's, you know, a specific set of connotations that comes up. The word itself comes from Chinese. It's all the way back to the 4th century BC, actually.
Wow.
But it wasn't really appropriated into Japanese until the 1800s, and you know, in Chinese it would be pronounced differently,
right?
But you know, it's if you break down the two characters that make it up, there you have kai, meaning strange. It's the same kai that's in yokai, you know, like traditional Japanese spirits.
Right.
And then you have ju, which is a beast, so it's a connotation of like a wild animal sort of situation. But just saying strange beast doesn't really capture it. You know, if you have a translator that's saying like, oh, it's a strange beast, they're not doing their job right.
Yeah.
And so generally monster is a good way to translate it, but at the same time, it's one of those things that, you know, there's lots of different words that could mean monster in Japanese.
Oh yeah.
So generally, the way that I think of it is a kaiju, because of when it was popularized. It was popularized in the 1950s, thanks to two movies, really. There was the original Godzilla, and there was The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. Both came out like roughly the same time frame. And this sort of, gives this mental image of like big rampaging creature.
Right.
And that's usually how it's used, but it can also be used in other contexts as well. So if you look at, I don't know if you're familiar with Busca, for an example.
No, I don't think so.
So Busca he's a pleasant kaiju. So he's something along the lines similar to like think of Big Bird, where it's sort of a humid size, or Barney the dinosaur, that sort of thing.
Right.
Like that could still fall under that same umbrella of kaiju. They're not fully animals. They're something that's strange and off about them. They are monsters in some sense of the word, but it's all tied back to that aesthetic that the special effects director Eiji Tsuburaya really nailed home, because he was the guy that was really in charge of launching the whole Godzilla series, and then later on he went on to launch the whole Ultraman series.
Right.
So between those two, like most of the time, if you say kaiju to a Japanese person, it's gonna make them think of either those old movies from the 60s or the Ultraman shows. Yeah. And that's where your head's gonna go first. And I think that's most people. If you say like Japanese monsters, they're not gonna think of like Sadako from The Ring. They're gonna think of Godzilla.
Or even they're usually not gonna think of yokai either.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But there's that other layer, or like the other aspect to the word, like the homophone, which is for the sea creatures, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So the kaiju, there's a homophone, as you said, where the kai is also can be ocean. So if you think of like marine mammals, those would be called kaiju. And I think that's also an important thing to remember, is that the biggest animals that have ever lived on Earth are whales. And Japan has a big whaling culture. When Tomoyuki Tanaka got the idea for Godzilla, he was flying over the ocean and looking down and thinking about what could be beneath the waves. So, the much more common term before Godzilla came about was the kaiju, meaning like sea monster. And the original title for Godzilla even had that term in it before the guy that sort of did the pitch novel, because they would create novelizations before the movie came out to sort of get a sense of what the movie was going to be. So this novelist, he's really the one that sort of transitioned it from sea monster to strange monster, and that term is stuck around in the lexicon ever since. But if you look at older stuff like the original King Kong or the Foghorn, the Ray Bradbury story, like those don't use kaiju in when they're referring to things. It's always kaibutsu, which is sort of a more broad general term for monsters.
Interesting. Huh. All right. So then we get to the book. So we get to Kaiju for Hipsters. And how do you go about, saying this is a kaiju movie, this is not a kaiju movie, I'm going to use this, I'm not going to use that?
Yeah. So there's a bit of a debate that launched online. It really started with Jason Barr put out a book from McFarlane called The Kaiju Movie, and it had Gorgo on the cover. And Gorgo is a monster movie from the UK, but it was originally going to be co-produced in Japan, and then that didn't work out. But at any rate, big debate. Like, this is something that is not from Japan. Does it still count as a kaiju?
Yeah. I
say yes. Some other people say no. We're going to disagree. But for my case, I thought, I think that we should address this. I wrote a bit of an article on how certain non-Japanese giant monsters are perceived in Japan, and really is breaking down like movie titles even, like, because the Japanese title for Gorgo is Kaiju Gorgo. I think that's pretty solid hill to stand on there.
Yeah.
But from there, it sort of continued to evolve, and later on, I sort of went with this and combined it with this other thing that I'm really heavily into the Godzilla fandom, and there's a bit of a problem there that people get blinders on sometimes, and I can understand this because Godzilla is fundamental, core, absolutely the center of this universe, of this genre. Right. But at the same time, there are lots of other things that are floating around out there, and people have no idea. So I thought, Godzilla's been talked about to death. If I had to talk about how great the original 1954 film is and be like the 3,000th person to do that, I would get so bored.
Right.
But how many people out there have talked about, the whale god, which is another, it's very similar to Godzilla in a lot of ways. But it's not really discussed at all. So that was sort of my goal is let's take a look at all of these movies that don't get talked about. So I just said, okay, let's write a book about monster movies from Japan, giant creatures. Some of them are straight from Japan. Some of them are Japanese influence. They have that aesthetic that Eiji Tsuburaya really mastered. Movies like Pacific Rim, where they call them kaiju, that's a direct homage you can see. Or, Cloverfield, where, when they're being interviewed, they say, oh yeah, we went to Japan, we looked at the toys, we thought these were really cool, we need to do something like that.
Right.
So that was really what I was thinking, was let's take all of these movies, and then let's just not talk about the Godzilla movies and talk about everything else.
Right. It's like I read the whole thing and I found it really interesting, especially because you connect so much of the movies to each other, and you tell this director worked on this, which eventually influenced this, and then you keep going and going and going, and there's like a whole web of interconnectedness between things that perhaps I think a lot of people, even included myself, don't know about. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of, let's say for an example, Keizo Murase is a sculptor. He makes monster suits. And he worked on a lot of the movies in the 60s Godzilla series. He, created Varan the Unbelievable and Mothra and Ghidra. And then in the 70s, the film industry in Japan was basically in apocalypse mode. And
as in, a lot of apocalypse-themed movies were coming out, right?
That is true, but also there were not as many movies coming out in Japan.
Okay.
The economy was not doing so hot at that point, and a lot of people, they just went overseas to find work, basically. And he was one of them, and he went over and he made several movies over there. And he's still proud of them. I got to meet him last year, and he came out, this 80-year-old man, in the suit from the Mighty Peking Man.
Wow.
Yeah. Which, is a fantastic monster movie, but I think it's not necessarily on everybody's radar. It doesn't even have a release with the original language track in the US. You have to import one if you want to watch it with the original Chinese audio.
Yeah.
So... that's one of the go-to examples of okay, this is definitely one where, there's this Japanese talent that's well established in, hardcore, the fundamentals of the capstone genre, which is the Godzilla series. That's what everybody's shooting for. And the people that work on this, they go abroad and do something else. Right. Same deal with say Pulgasari, which is
right. Oh,
that's a crazy story.
Please tell us about that a bit, because I'm sure some people have heard of it, but it's a story that's worth retelling, I think.
Yeah, this is a story it's been talked about on the Daily Show. I believe it's been talked about on Last Week Tonight. So this was in the 1980s. Kim Jong-il of North Korea was a big fan of movies, and he really wanted to get his propaganda off the ground, and he wanted to have Korean movies that were of competitive quality with the rest of the world. So he kidnapped an actress.
Of course, makes total sense, right?
Yeah, and then proceeded to kidnap her ex-husband, who was a director, and then they were just held under duress, making movies in North Korea for a while. And then while that was going on, he reaches out to Toho Studios, who had just come off of Return of Godzilla, their big successful relaunch in 1984, and is like, okay, well, let's get the special effects director and the the actor that played Godzilla and a few others, little man Machan who played Minina, the son of Godzilla, in the 60s. He gets the whole this whole crew out. They don't really know what's going on. Some of them didn't even know they were going to North Korea until they got there.
Jeez.
And they make this monster movie that's really just tonally bizarre, because you watch it and it's not entirely clear how it's propaganda or if it's subverting the propaganda, and because it's it seems initially like it's about the people's revolution against this this terrible regime by they have a monster that they're going to use to take over, overthrow the government. But then the monster keeps growing and growing, and you're like, well, what is this saying? Because eventually they have to fight the monster that they've created, and just like, wow, this it seems like it's subversive, but I feel like that symbolism couldn't have been lost on the people that were watching it at the time. So how'd this get okayed?
And apparently there's like really good production value, or at least it seems like there is, because of the unique way it was made, right?
Yeah, well, it's a bizarre thing because the North Korean film industry was not particularly experienced, but they had a lot of resources. Yeah. So it's one of those deals. It's not in this movie, but another example would be like, most of the time, if you want to film a train wreck, you set up elaborate models and you try to do everything in miniature work. But there, you could just be like, all right, we'll just derail this train. So,
yeah, Dear Leader said, blow up this train, so I guess we have to do it. Right?
Yeah, so it's a completely different world where that was made, and the movie is, I don't even fully understand what the licensing situation would be for Pulgasari. I believe it's streaming on Amazon Prime right now, but I don't know.
Really?
I don't know if that means that it's a licensed release or just somebody put it up, because that happens.
Oh, really? You can just put something up on Amazon Prime without... I didn't know that.
It was a big problem with a One Cut of the Dead recently, that somebody just put up a bootleg and was reaping rewards for it. It was not good.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Okay. I had no idea about that. So just going off of that, there's many productions that ended up using Japanese talent and going abroad. You talk about, for example, I think it was in Taiwan, how they started doing these like kind of fantasy movies that were kind of built on the back of like these ninja movies in Japan or something like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there were a series of ninja films that came out in Japan with young child protagonists that really took off, and because they were so popular abroad in Taiwan, they actually started emulating them, and they even brought directors and some of the actors over to do co-productions over there as well. So you have like these Japanese actors in Taiwanese productions, which isn't as troubling as you might think, because they didn't have synchronized sound, so they could just dub over it with whatever. But there's a whole lot of them, and unfortunately they're not very well preserved, and the Taiwanese film industry, I think, was not really thinking about reissuing movies for years and years and years, and sometimes stock footage from these fantasy films has been used in other movies, and then the best possible way to see that footage is now by watching another movie that was made 5 years later, where they use the same special effects over.
Right.
To comic effects sometimes, because they don't seem to, as much as film preservation isn't a thing, I don't think copyright is the thing either. So they'll just be using music from Star Trek and Once Upon a Time in the West and all sorts of things.
So I know you rewatched a lot of the movies when you were putting the book together, but I assume you also must have watched a few for the first time when you were making the book, rather.
Oh, absolutely. But part of it was an excuse to watch things that I hadn't gotten around to yet.
So did you end up like discovering little things like that, like, oh, this is, the stock footage from, whatever, I know this thing, I've seen this, or I know this, but I didn't realize it would be in this. Like, did you discover stuff like that along the way?
A little bit. A lot of it was working on the backs of good people like tarstarkus.net, where they've really done fantastic jobs of cataloging a lot of these rarities that it just don't get discussed very much. And thank God for whoever is going through and actually like combing through old VHS bins and whatnot in Taiwan, because it is very difficult to come across some of these things.
Yeah. What would be one of the more difficult ones that you had to try to track down?
Well, it's actually not in the book right now, but I recently got a copy of Pretty Executor, which was directed by one of the suit actors in the Godzilla franchise. He played like Godzillasaurus in the 90s. Guy's name is Hurricane Ryu. And that was one that, it had a VHS release in Japan, but it's consistently been like out of stock on Amazon.com, and you go to Yahoo Auctions and look around for it, and no dice. So things like that are difficult sometimes. So and there are other times where there are things that, I was unaware, but it looks like this is just on YouTube, but I completely either learned about it and then forgot, or nobody made me aware of it until now. So there's an Indian movie from 1965, Sinbad, Alibaba, and Aladdin. It might be a different order for those three, but that was one that Tsuburaya sent people over to India to work on the special effects, and this was before Ultra Q was even on television. So that was really early in the company's history, and that is completely not talked about.
That's really interesting to see, like, how behind the scenes Japan had this influence and in a sense like prestige, right? People were going to them to do these things. That's really interesting.
Absolutely, and then that continued at least into the late 1970s. With the unmade Toho Hammer Films collaboration for Nessie. They were going to make a Loch Ness Monster movie. And they were going to be doing the special effects in Japan for this British monster movie. And this is a company that worked with Ray Harryhausen, so they're not exactly hurting for talent.
Yeah. Okay. So there is in the 70s, of course, you get a very famous movie among people who are into this sort of thing, at least, called House. Right?
Oh, yes.
Which is directed by Nobuhiko Obayashi, right?
Yes.
And of course, if you haven't seen House, I think that's one worth watching. It's quite an experience. It's a horror, psychedelic, just crazy movie, but a fun one. And but as I was reading your book, I found out Obayashi has this interesting connection to not just Kaiju, but also Godzilla, and it's a connection worthy of Obayashi, I thought. Yes, he has this reputation of being, this outlandish director. Could you explain a little bit like what his connection to Kaiju is, and then go into that whole Godzilla thing, which I was really excited to learn about?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there are a number of connections with him. I think he was actually neighbors with Ishiro Honda, so he puts Honda in a bunch of cameos in his movies. And he put Godzilla. There's actually a Godzilla cameo in The Adventures of Kosuke Kandaichi, and some other things. The movie. One of the movies that's in the book is Kenya Boy, which is...
I was just watching clips of that today. Interesting.
Like every Obayashi movie, it's a trip.
Yeah.
But I'm assuming that what you want to hear about, and this will... I know you like to do those like quirky cold opens where somebody says something crazy, so I think you're going to like to hear about the unmade Godzilla movie where Godzilla dies of diabetes, so people turn her corpse into a spaceship and send it back to fight in a revolution on the Godzilla home planet.
Oh, that old thing, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, please. So, how did that come about? Okay, so none of what you said was a lie. You weren't making that up. That is an actual thing that almost perhaps got made that Obayashi was involved with. But how did that come about?
Yeah, so the details are a little bit scarce on it, but it was the 1970s, and Toho was really, they wanted to bring Godzilla back because Godzilla had been on hiatus since 1975. And there were all sorts of ideas that were talked about for the return of Godzilla, which eventually wound up happening in 1984. Yeah. But you can find just tons and tons of different drafts. John LeMay has an excellent book that's just all unmade kaiju movies. But Obayashi, he seemed to have this idea, and he was a hot director at Toho after House. Toho didn't want House to succeed, but it did. So, as a result, he had this sort of vision of, all right, I'm going to bring Godaigo, who did the music, in, and it's going to have the same cinematographer as House, and it's going to be stop motion animation. And he had this like big elaborate plan for this Godzilla movie, which for whatever reason didn't happen, probably because it's bonkers. Yeah. And that didn't happen. And what he wound up doing was he went ahead and he published the treatment across 2 issues of Starlog magazine in Japan. And he got then unknown illustrator Katsuhiro Otomo to do illustrations for it.
So of course he's famous for Akira among other projects, but I guess Akira is the one that he's best known for in the US, especially, or in the West.
Oh yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So you can sort of see it in some of the illustrations that it's his style. He was one of 2 illustrators that worked on the serialization, so you can't always tell which ones are his and which ones are the other fellows. But he did an art exhibition with certain pieces from it. So I don't know if you've seen the story or not.
I was looking at your blog entry for it, so I kind of looked through it a little bit, but yeah.
So for an example, like one of his is the grand space scene where Godzilla as a spaceship is floating through space, and there's in the background I think it's Saturn or something, and it's very 2001 inspired.
Yeah.
But yeah, this movie would have been prohibitively expensive, completely unmarketable in the rest of the world, and absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. It's really interesting that they were trying to go with a stop motion approach, right? Like rather than a suit.
I think there was a perception that suitmation was a little bit hokey at the time. Tsuburaya had recently done a television series called Born Free, where they had sort of gone away from using suitmation for their dinosaurs and were doing things in stop motion to be more like paleontologically accurate, but that was also expensive. So eventually they went back to the suitmation. But also Obayashi, his style is just really eccentric. So, when he was making House, they initially wanted Teruyoshi Nakano to work on it, who had also worked on the Godzilla movies. And he said, no, it would be too realistic if he worked on it. So that makes me really wonder exactly what a Space Godzilla would have been had it actually gotten a release in the 70s.
Yeah, I mean, usually they say, whatever you can picture is probably crazier than the real thing, but we're talking about Obayashi, so I don't know if that applies.
So the main villain, General Gamini, is like this large frog creature who is able to vomit spiders. She has giant breasts that have flamethrowers in them, and then she shoots shuriken from her navel that are shaped like swastikas. So, yeah, that's not a combination I would have come up with on my own.
Yeah, you just made my point right there, yeah. Okay. Well, that's they can read the translation. People can read the translation on your blog, right?
Yes. Okay. My girlfriend did a translation of it. We figured, if Starlog printed it some 40 some years ago, and the people need to know. So.
Yeah. All right, I will put the links for that in the show notes for people to go take a look at, because it's definitely worth reading.
And Toho is making Godzilla movies again. Obayashi is still making movies.
Yep.
Like, I'm just saying, we could put some pressure on them, make this happen.
You never know, right? Oh man. All right. Okay. So speaking of peculiar directors, I think you know where I'm going. Yeah.
I have a sense.
Yeah. So Hideaki Anno, right? Now everybody knows him for Evangelion, but and more recently Shin Godzilla, right?
Right.
But he's got a very aside from just a very interesting career and personal life, he also has an interesting long history with Kaiju and particularly Ultraman, correct?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So in the 1980s, there was sort of a drought of tokusatsu material because Ultraman Leo had gone off the air in 1975. Godzilla had his last movie in 1975, and then there was just occasional things here and there, but it wasn't that boom that you got in the 60s or the early 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And to sort of pick up the slack, all these kids that had grown up with this stuff, they decided that they were going to make their own fan films.
Mm-hmm.
So Shinya Tsukamoto of Tetsuo the Iron Man was one.
Yeah.
Minoru Kawasaki of the Calamari Wrestler was one.
Yeah.
And so was young Hideaki Anno. And he got together with a bunch of his peers at Osaka University of Arts in 1980, and they started working on these amateur projects that basically wound up evolving into Gainax.
Mm-hmm.
The roots of it. If you look, Akai and Yamaga and Higuchi, like they're all sort of around at that time.
Right.
So Gainax doesn't start off necessarily doing anime, though. They start off with these live action projects.
Mm-hmm.
They had their shorts, the Daikon films that opened up the Daikon convention, and that put them on the map. But they did a lot of like direct to video, sort of 8mm and eventually a 16mm features.
Right.
And one of the most notorious ones is the Hideaki Anno Return of Ultraman.
Yeah, I was looking at that yesterday. But actually, so I saw Blue Blazes like a few years ago. Blue Blazes Aoi Hono, which is like this Japanese drama based on those experiences, right? One of the guys, I can't remember his name. He wrote a book about it, right?
Yeah, it was Kazuhiko Shimamoto's manga.
Right. Yeah,
I absolutely recommend that drama series to anyone.
I love it. And, of course, I'm sure they embellish certain things and all that stuff. But it's still a really, really fun watch, like regardless whether or not you care at all about Hideaki Anno. It's just a fun, interesting show.
It's full of like quirky weirdo characters.
Yes,
that you want
the editor,
cheer
Mad
for.
Holy. Do you remember?
Yeah.
Oh my god, like that guy cracked me up every time he was on screen. Like, just a crazy editor guy, and everybody's just quirky, and it's super fun. But yeah, so I saw the Ultraman thing. They kind of recreated there, right? But I looked it up on YouTube, and I was also watching it last night. So very interesting stuff. Please, I'm sorry.
Oh no. I'll talk about Blue Blazes ad nauseam.
Yeah. Okay.
So what they recreated in that were like his very first sort of student films, which sort of led into the return of Ultraman. So he did like Ultraman, and then I think the second one might have been just like Ultraman 2 or just another Ultraman or something along those lines. Return of Ultraman was like the big high profile one.
Uh-huh.
And all of these, Anno plays Ultraman, but he doesn't wear an Ultraman costume.
Right.
He's just himself in jeans and a jacket with like a color timer. And so for the student films, they were very low budget, and they used the sound from Ultraman to give it that big feel, but it was obviously still sort of, okay, well, we're doing this on $1.50 and filming out in the playground. Whereas with this movie, it's, proper sets, miniatures, the Kaiju costume is all done, but Anno's still just Anno.
He's just a guy, yeah.
Yeah. And you think like, well, is this a comedy? But nothing else is funny.
No, everything's just deadpan, serious. It's like something straight out of Ultraman, except Ultraman's not Ultraman, it's Hideaki Anno.
Which I think that makes it better somehow.
No, well, that makes it super memorable, right? Like, because if it was just like a super accurate Ultraman suit, you'd go like, oh, this was cool, but then it would kind of fade away. But this thing will live forever because it's Hideaki Anno. Like, you see him, you see his face, you see him just wearing normal clothes.
So they had to skirt some copyrights. So, much like you have the Asylum, they make Transmorphers instead of Transformers. They sort of played around with the katakana. So instead of Urutoraman, it's like Uno Re Tora Maso or something like that. Where it's like, if you squint, it looks like it.
Yeah.
But eventually, because Anno became this big celebrity and Tsuburaya is also a really chill company, they gave them a license to just release this product. So it's now this weird, like, is this official now? Is it exists as part of the canon? You can buy action figures of the Hideaki Anno version of Ultraman.
I was listening to an episode of your podcast last night on Hideaki Anno, and I believe you own one of those, right?
Yes, I put one on the back cover of the book, actually.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. But yeah, like the whole Ultraman influence that he's carried on with him has shown up in multiple other projects, correct?
Pretty much everything, and that's that's one of my big things that I do is I go and rant about this is a reference to this and blah 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 blah. So when you watch Nadia, and it's like, well, you're actually an alien from the planet M78, and people that don't watch Japanese special effects things are just like, okay, well, that's weird. I wonder if that's significant. But if you know that, Ultraman is an alien from planet M78, he also has a blue crystal, okay, I see what you're doing here.
Yeah.
And then, Evangelion is just essentially a giant pastiche of a lot of things, including, Jerry Anderson's UFO and Devilman, and Ultraman is right there, like hardcore front and center on that. Mm-hmm. So you can see that, all over, especially Anno's work, if it's other people at Gainax, they tend to reference other things, but Anno has a particular, taste for Ultraman that you can see things where, like, the second Evangelion rebuild has a scene that's basically a shot for shot of a bit from Ultraman Nexus, which was, also very similar to a scene from Gamera 3, which Anno directed the making of Gamera 3. So, yeah. It's all very circular, and then you can say, like, oh, does this also look like Utena? And, it's all wishy-washy. There's a lot of things bleeding over onto each other.
Right.
But, I mean, essentially, I don't think anyone will deny, if you look at the big giant grappling and the Monster of the Week format that you have in Evangelion, that it is essentially Ultraman. So people say, like, oh, this is a deconstruction of Mazinger Z. A little bit, but I feel like it comes more from the Ultraman shows. Right.
Yeah, I think as Americans or Westerners that don't grow up in Japan, there are so many references in Japanese pop culture that go over our heads, right? But when you start to kind of like piece things together like that, like you do in the book, it's really interesting. It gives things a whole new layer that you can appreciate.
And there's, as long as I've been in it, I'll go back and rewatch something, and there'll be more things that I catch that I didn't catch the previous time. And so it's sort of a never-ending, constantly rewarding feedback loop.
Yeah. It's fun stuff,
I've got a YouTube video on just on references in Ultraman that if you're not in the UK, you can watch. If you're in the UK, I'm sorry, but there were problems because I have a clip from UFO that I used for reference. So
all right,
got a copyright strike on it.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So you recommended a specific movie to me. Well, you recommended several movies, which we can bring up a few of them. But perhaps we can start with Love and Peace, and then we can name a few other ones for people that are interested in checking out, something beyond Godzilla. Some kind of something a little bit different, like the kinds of movies that you outline in Kaiju for Hipsters.
Yeah, I mean, Love and Peace is a textbook example of why I do what I do in this book, because it's such a fantastic movie. It's a movie that I feel like you could watch with most people, and most people should get something out of it.
It's a totally relatable story, right? And there is a big giant turtle, and that's a great scene, but it's just at its core a fundamentally like relatable human story.
Yeah, it's a rags to riches, back to rags love story. There's music.
Catchy music.
Yes.
Sung by a turtle.
You'll hear it over and over again.
Yeah.
So it'll become an earworm.
Yes.
And Hiroki Hasegawa, he's got a good singing voice. If you saw him only in the Attack on Titan movies or in Shin Godzilla, and you're like sort of, I don't know about this guy, watch Love and Peace, because you'll get a whole new perception of him.
Yeah.
It's, I don't know how much to spoil about this movie, but
we can just give the general premise before we, don't need to go all the way to the end.
Yeah. So it's, about a guy that he wants to become a rock singer, but he's sort of a wage slave. All of his coworkers treat him like dirt, and he gets a little turtle, and he has it as his pet, and he brings it to work with him. This is not a good idea because his coworkers rag on him endlessly, and eventually he's a very sort of passive, submissive guy, and he freaks out and he flushes the turtle down the sewer. And it doesn't become a ninja, but it does wind up sort of in this this magical place where discarded things accumulate, which that's sort of along the lines of some of the spiritualism that you sometimes see in Japanese things, of like, discarded objects have their own thoughts and feelings. And so the turtle is supposed to be imbued with the power of speech, but the wizard that wants to give it the power screws up, and instead it gives the turtle the power to grant wishes. So now our hero, Ryoichi, he starts all of a sudden being recognized for his singing ability, and he gets more and more famous as the turtle still has affection for him and it wants to make his dreams come true. So it's granting him with this. But as he's rising higher and higher to fame, the turtle is getting bigger and bigger and bigger under Tokyo. And all of this comes to a head on Christmas Eve.
Yeah.
So it is a Christmas movie. Watch it at Christmas time.
Yeah, no, it's a great movie. I really enjoyed it, so I totally recommend to go check it out. Now, the problem is it's not that easy to track down, right? Even though it's a pretty recent movie. I think it was like 2015, was it?
Yeah, I don't understand, because it's a Sion Sono movie. His movies are fairly well regarded. You can find, say Tokyo Tribes pretty easily.
Oh, yeah.
And this is a movie also that played in theaters in the US, at least a limited release. I saw it in Chicago in the theater, and yet it's no home video release here. So fortunately, Third Window Films in the UK has put it out on Blu-ray, so you can, track it down that way. And I would recommend doing it. And other than that, we did have a screening of it at the last G-Fest in Chicago.
So yeah, do a little bit of searching, maybe imported from the UK or hopefully another film festival or local con or something. It can show it soon, but definitely track it down if you can. Yeah.
So you get to check out any of the other titles?
I have not watched anything in its entirety. I just kind of skipped around a little bit. But for anybody looking to check out something else, what could you give a couple? Just 2 or 3. We don't need to. Everybody should go check out the book because there's so much more in there, but just a little taste of something else they can check out.
Sure thing. Yeah. I have over 100 reviews in here, so there's a lot to choose from. There's so
many more than 100 because you mentioned like this movie, like 5 movies within like one because it's related to the other one. So there's just so much to go into.
Yeah. anything that I have down here as a 5 stars, I think is a good place to check. So, if you haven't checked out the Daimajin franchise, those are fantastic. Those, it's made by Daiei, who also made the Gamera movies. And you might think like, oh, the people that made the Gamera movies in the 60s are not so good. But these are also the people that made the Zatoichi movies in the 60s. And it leans a little closer to that area, where these are basically like period samurai dramas. Generally speaking, the layout of a Daimajin movie is there's a warlord that is oppressing a people. The people are suffering. The people pray to their god statue that is somewhere adjacent to their village. And in the last 15 minutes, things go crazy. God's statue comes to life, and they make the bad guys pay.
Yeah.
Great special effects. Great music by Akira Ifukube, who the same guy that did the Godzilla music. Really menacing look of the main character, and again, one of those things that you'll see referenced places. Right. I was reading Ranma 1/2 the other day, and there was a Daimajin reference, and I took a snapshot of it, and I sent it to my friends, like, "Hey, look at this."
Yeah. No, like I said, they're all over the place, but they just go over our heads. Yeah, because most people don't know that stuff.
Yep. Similar deal, also from the 60s, the Magic Serpent is one of those Tale of Jiraiya things. Right. It's a crazy, like, ninja magic all over. People get decapitated and their heads fly around, turning into logs and things like that. If you want to see where Naruto came from, watch the Magic Serpent, including the summoning of a giant toad and a giant dragon.
Right.
But on top of that, watch it if you want to see where Star Wars came from, because there's a lot of stuff in the Magic Serpent that is eerily close to Star Wars. And Star Wars is just like Evangelion in that it's just pulling influences left and right. It's like Quentin Tarantino. Basically similar deal.
Right.
So those would be high recommendations. If you want something a little more recent, maybe, Ultraman the Next, which was sort of the dark, gritty, modernized reboot of Ultraman that they tried in 2004. Something maybe a little bit more off the beaten track. Twilight of the Cockroaches. That's something that just got a DVD release finally.
Oh, really? Oh.
Yeah. So that's live action animation hybrid where you have the Society of Cockroaches that are done in an anime style, but the people are in live action. Yeah. And it's all about the people coming in and wiping out the cockroaches. And it absolutely plays like a kaiju movie from the reverse perspective of like the cockroach society is being threatened by this interloping huge human.
Right. Yeah. There's just so much. Like I thought, I want to watch this, but it's just like, you need to find more hours in the day.
It can be a tall order. So hopefully this helps guide people a little bit. So if you're sitting there and on one hand you have a copy of Gehara and then the other hand you have a copy of Psycho Shark, not to watch Psycho Shark ever.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a great guide. So, okay, so you can get the book on Amazon. That's where I got it. I got the Kindle version and I read it that way. But there's also a physical version you can buy, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm. If you get the physical version, the Kindle version is free. Mm-hmm. I've had people that they get the book and they're like, "Oh, this is £2. How am I going to take this around with me?" Like, you can get the Kindle one for free, and then if I make any tweaks, the first edition that I rushed out did have some typos in it because I wanted to get it out in time for convention season, but that's been mostly ironed out by this point. Mm-hmm. But if anything else little like that changes, then that automatically gets updated with the Kindle version, so you don't have to worry about that.
Awesome. And where can people go online to find your stuff, like all the stuff you write about, your podcasts and all that? Yeah,
that's all at the Maser Patrol blog, MASER, like the tanks that they have in the Godzilla franchise that shoot microwaves instead of usual lasers.
Right.
So that's at maserpatrol.wordpress.com.
Awesome. Okay.
I haven't sprung for a full, regular.com because I'm stingy, but we have, articles up, translations of little ephemera and, news recaps. We do podcasts where it's myself and sort of rotating panel of guests. And then the book, Kaiju for Hipsters, you can find it on Amazon.com.
Awesome. All right. Well, Kevin, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your fascinating knowledge of crazy kaiju movies.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm stoked.
Okay, so one more time. Kaiju for Hipsters, go check that out. It's a fun book. And after you read it, you're going to be thinking like, oh my God, I got to check out this movie. And yeah, just tons of interesting stuff in there that we barely scratch the surface. One more thing too, Kevin wanted me to remind everyone, and I think it's an appropriate reminder, something that should have come up during the interview actually, but Godzilla King of the Monsters is coming out May 31st, okay? It's almost upon us. So, yeah, if you're listening to this shortly after it came out in May of 2019, then yeah, you got something to look forward. And if it's way after that, then I guess go stream it somewhere. Definitely worth checking out. All right, so if you enjoy Japan Station, well, first of all, please subscribe. I mean, you don't want to miss an episode, right? You can go to japanstationpodcast.com and check out the show notes and everything there. That is one way you can download your episodes through there. But if you use iTunes or Google Play or Stitcher or TuneIn or whatever other podcast platform, you can just subscribe and make sure you don't miss any episodes. Also, you can leave a review. If you're enjoying the show, then please leave a review. Share your thoughts on the show, okay? Just tell people, I enjoyed the part about Godzilla being shot into outer space. No, but seriously, yeah, that helps people find out about the show and, yeah, keep on growing. So please just keep that in mind, all right? If you have any questions or comments, just email me, mail@japanstationpodcast.com. And if you want to stay up to date with all future developments, Japankyo and Japan Station related, then you can go to @Japankyo on Facebook, hit that like button, or @Japankyo News, you can hit the follow button. All right, so just, there you go. Go do that. You got homework. Another thing to do. As always, thank you so much to Me for the opening and closing song. And yeah, that does it. That's it. That's episode 12, a fun one. Episode 13 is coming soon. I'm not sure if it'll be May 15th or June 1st, but yeah, keep an eye out on social media to find out exactly when. All right, so yeah, yay kaiju, we did it. Go find your miniature kaiju. I mean, go find your miniature pony.
Just do it! Oh,